Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back to April 10th, 1912. You are standing on the docks of Southampton, surrounded by a sea of wool caps, heavy trunks, and the frantic energy of 1,000 lives about to change. The air is a thick, soup like mixture of coal smoke, horse manure from the carriage teams, and the sharp, biting tang of salty sea spray hitting the harbor. Looming over you like a mountain of rivets and black paint is the Titanic. Imagine the largest thing you have ever seen, then double it and paint it with the confidence of an empire that thought it had conquered nature itself. It is breathtaking, truly, but let's be real, if this were today, you would probably be complaining that the boarding line is longer than a DMV queue on a Monday morning and that there is zero chance of finding a decent charging port for your phone. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always find it cozy to think of us all gathered in this digital space, drifting off at different hours. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, the weight of your single cardboard suitcase pulling at your shoulder. To the wealthy elite boarding further up the pier, this ship is a floating palace of mahogany and crystal. To you, a third-class passenger, it is a steel whale that promises a ticket out of a dead-end life. You're not just a passenger, you are steerage. It is a term that sounds like something you do to cattle. And honestly, the process feels a bit like that too. You are part of the 700 plus souls who have scraped together every penny, or perhaps had a village chip in, just to see the Statue of Liberty without a postcard in the way. The first thing you notice isn't the grandeur, but the smell of the docks. It is a pungent, greasy aroma, a blend of wet wool, cheap tobacco, and the underlying scent of industrial progress. You're standing in a line that seems to stretch into the next century. This is your first hurdle, the medical inspection. Modern air travel has the TSA, which is its own brand of misery involving taking off your shoes and hoping your socks don't have holes. But in 1912, the inspection is much more personal and significantly more awkward. You move toward a man in a crisp uniform who looks like he hasn't smiled since the Victorian era ended. He isn't checking for liquids over 3 ounces. He's looking for lice and trachoma. As you reach the front, he grabs your chin with a firm, impersonal grip. He peels back your eyelids with a quick, practiced flick of his thumb, looking for the telltale redness of a contagious eye disease that could get you deported the moment you hit New York. It is a bizarrely intimate moment with a stranger. Historians still argue whether these medical screenings were genuinely about public health or just a convenient way for authorities to weed out the undesirables before they even stepped foot on American soil. If you fail here, your dream ends on a damp pier in England, but your eyes are clear, or at least clear enough to pass, and he moves onto your scalp, checking for any unwanted hitchhikers in your hair. It's like a very judgmental, very public version of a kindergarten head lice check, only the stakes are your entire future. Once you are cleared, you are handed your inspection card. You pin it to your heavy coat like a badge of honor, or perhaps a price tag. It is your golden ticket, your proof that you are clean enough to enter the belly of the beast. You look up at the hull again. The black paint is so fresh it almost looks wet, reflecting the gray English sky. You start to walk up the gangway, and the sound of your boots changes from the dull thud of wooden planks to the hollow, metallic ring of the ship's steel plate. This is the moment it becomes real. You are leaving the ground. As you enter the ship through a side hatch, none of that grand staircase nonsense for you. The temperature drops and the air changes. It no longer smells like the open harbor. It smells like fresh paint, new linoleum, and the faint, vibrating scent of oil. It's a bit like the new car smell, if that new car was the size of a city block and powered by a small sun's worth of coal. You find yourself in a long, narrow corridor painted a stark, clinical white. The lighting is electric, which is a massive flex for 1912. For many of your fellow travelers, this is the first time they have ever seen a light bulb that didn't involve a wick and a match. It's bright, humming, and slightly sterile, reminding you more of a hospital hallway than a luxury liner. You follow the signs. or rather, you follow the flow of people because the signs are in English and half. The people around you are speaking Swedish, Italian, or Arabic. The Titanic was a linguistic kaleidoscope. Interestingly, a quirky fringe tidbit of history suggests that the White Star Line actually preferred their third class to be a mix of nationalities to prevent any single group from organizing a mutiny or a protest. Though, let's be honest, everyone was probably too busy being seasick or amazed to worry about taking over the ship. You descend deeper and deeper. You are moving toward the G deck right above the waterline. The vibration starts here. It isn't a loud noise yet, but a physical sensation that crawls up through the soles of your boots and settles in your teeth. It's the heartbeat of the Titanic, the massive reciprocating engine starting to churn. Every step you take down the narrow iron stairs feels like you are descending into the guts of a giant. The walls here aren't covered in silk wallpaper. They are bare steel, held together by rivets the size of dinner. Plates. You pass a steward who looks like he's seen everything and cared about none of it. He points you toward a door that looks like every other door in this labyrinth. You reach your cabin. Well, cabin is a generous term. It's more like a closet with ambitions. You push the door open and the smell of 4 people in a space the size of a modern walk-in pantry hits you. It's a mix of soap, damp clothing, and the seaweed that was used to stuff the mattresses. Yes, seaweed. It was considered a fire retardant material back then, which is a bit of a grim irony when you think about it. You see your bunk. It's narrow, with a thin blanket and a pillow that feels like it was stuffed with broken promises. But as you sit down, feeling the ship groan and lurch as it begins to pull away from the dock, a sense of excitement washes over you. You are on the unsinkable ship. You've made it past the doctors, past the soot of the docks, and you are finally on your way. You lean your head against a vibrating steel wall, closing your eyes as the muffled cheers from the pier fade into the distance, replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical thrum of the great iron heart beneath you. You drop your suitcase onto the lower bunk, which, let's be honest, is about as plush as a yoga mat made of sun-dried cardboard. This is your home for the next week. A room roughly the size of a modern-day elevator, but without the awkward music and with a much higher chance of structural failure. You are sharing this space with 3 other men you've never met. One is a tall, silent Swede who seems to be trying to communicate through intense staring, and the others are brothers from Ireland who haven't stopped talking about the streets paved with gold in New York since they stepped over the threshold. It's cozy in the same way a tin of sardines is cozy. You're all in it together, and you're definitely going to know what everyone had for breakfast by day 3. The walls are a stark, glossy white, designed to reflect the single electric bulb that hangs from the ceiling like a lonely, glowing fruit. It's practical, easy to clean, and gives the whole place the vibe of a very high-end Victorian asylum. You reach out and touch the wall, and the vibration from the engines below is even more pronounced here. It's a deep sub-bass hum that you don't just hear with your ears, you feel it in your marrow. It's like sleeping on top of a giant purring cat. If that cat weighed 46,000 tons and was currently drinking coal by the shovel load. Historians still argue whether the constant vibration in the stern cabins was a design flaw or just an unavoidable consequence of placing the third class directly over the massive propeller shafts. But for you, it's just the Titanic massage feature. If people paid for this kind of rhythmic thrumming in a modern hotel, they'd call it a sensory wellness experience, but here it's just a soundtrack to your new life. You look at your bed. The blanket is made of a rough, scratchy wool that feels like it was woven from the hair of a very angry goat. It's marked with the White Star Line logo, a reminder that, Arnad, even in your sleep, you are the property of a corporation. And then there's the mattress. As you press your hand into it, you hear a faint, organic crunch. This is the famous seaweed stuffing we talked about. It's supposed to be hygienic, which in 1912 was a fancy way of saying the bugs don't like eating it as much as they like eating straw. It has a peculiar faint scent, a mix of dried salt, old kelp, and a hint of a dusty attic. It's not exactly the scent of lavender and dreams, but it's better than the smell of the steerage quarters on lesser ships, which usually favored a bouquet of damp hay and despair. A mainstream historical fact that often gets overlooked is that the Titanic's third class was actually revolutionary for its time. On most other ships, steerage meant one massive, open dormitory where hundreds of people slept in tiered bunks with zero privacy. Basically like a floating barracks where everyone's snoring combined into a localized thunderstorm. The Titanic, however, offered these private cabins. Even if they were tiny, having a door you could close was the height of luxury for a working class immigrant. It gave you a sense of dignity, a small patch of yours in a world that usually treated you like a statistic. Of course, the door doesn't have a lock on the inside, safety regulations and all that, but hey, baby steps toward the American dream, right? In the corner of the room sits a small folding wash basin made of white porcelain. It's a marvel of compact engineering. You flip it down and it looks like a giant, toothless mouth waiting for you to brush your teeth. There's no running water in the way you're used to. You don't just turn a tap and get a steaming hot shower. No, you have a small carafe of fresh water, and once you've used it to splash your face, you tip the basin back up, and the used water disappears into a hidden drain. It's a bit like a magic trick, only the prize is slightly grayish. Soap water. Speaking of soap, the White Star Line actually provided it along with clean towels. This was a quirky fringe tidbit that set the ship apart. Most liners expected third-class passengers to bring their own hygiene supplies, leading to a journey that got progressively more fragrant as the days went by. Here, they want you to stay relatively fresh, mostly so you don't offend the nostrils of the first-class passengers if the wind happens to blow the wrong way. You decide to test the automatic massage feature and lie down. The ceiling is so low that if you sit up too fast, you'll give yourself a cartoonish lump on the head. You lie there, staring at the rivets in the steel beams above you. Each one of those rivets was hammered in by hand by a worker in Belfast who was probably earning just enough to buy a pint and a loaf of bread. You can see the slight imperfections in the metal, the way the white paint has pooled around the edges. It's a reminder that this unsinkable marvel is a handmade object. It's a weirdly comforting thought until you remember that you're currently several feet below the waterline. If you were to drill a hole right through that vibrating wall next to your ear, you'd be greeted by a high-pressure jet of North Atlantic seawater that would turn your cabin into a very cold, very salty aquarium in about 10 seconds. But let's not think about that. You're on the safest ship ever built, or so the brochure said, and they wouldn't lie to you, would they? That would be bad for reviews, and even in 1912, reputation was everything. The Irishman in the bunk across from you strikes up a conversation. He's headed to Chicago to work in the rail yards. He asks you what you're planning to do. You realize you don't really have a plan beyond not being poor anymore, which was a pretty popular career path back then. The air in the cabin is starting to feel a bit thick. There's no air conditioning, obviously. Ventilation is handled by a series of humongous ventilator cowls on the top deck that suck air down through a series of shafts. It works, mostly, but it also carries the sounds of the ship with it. You can hear the distant clang of a shovel against a furnace floor, the muffled shout of a steward in the hall, and the constant, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the engines. You find yourself missing the modern world for a second, not for the internet or the fast food, but for the silence. In 1912, the world was a noisy, mechanical place. Steam was the king, and steam is loud. It hisses, it groans, it screams. Even here, in your private cabin, you are never truly alone with your thoughts. The ship is talking to you, a constant metallic monologue about pressure and torque and the sheer audacity of moving 50,000 tons of steel across an ocean. You close your eyes, trying to find a rhythm in the noise. It's like trying to sleep inside a giant clock. Just as you start to drift as off, one of the Irish brothers lets out a snore that sounds like a chainsaw hitting a knot in a log. Welcome to the Titanic, my friend. It's going to be a long trip. You decide that staying in your seaweed-stuffed bunk is a one-way ticket to a claustrophobic meltdown, so you slip out of the cabin and into the hallway. If you thought the cabin was tight, the corridors of the G deck are a whole new level of intimate. It's like navigating the inner workings of a giant white-painted clock where every gear is a person trying to go in the opposite direction. There are no Google Maps here, no blue dots to tell you where you are, and certainly no "you are here" kiosks with a helpful star. You are effectively lost in a steel maze that was designed by people who prioritize structural integrity over user-friendly navigation. Navigating the Titanic's lower decks is like trying to find the exit of an IKEA during a power outage, except instead of Swedish meatballs at the end, there's just more steel and the faint smell of boiled cabbage. As you wander, you notice the sheer scale of the Scotland Road. This isn't an actual road, of course, but a massive 3.7-meter wide corridor on E deck that runs almost the entire length of the ship. This is a mainstream historical fact that most people forget. The Titanic had its own internal highway. It was named after a famous street in Liverpool, and it served as the main artery for crew members and third-class passengers to move from one end of the ship to the other. Walking down, it feels like being inside the world's longest, cleanest pipe. The floor is covered in red and white linoleum that has a very specific waxy smell, a scent that would probably be marketed today as industrial freshness or essence of factory. It's a sensory overload of white painted rivets, the rhythmic thud-thud of footsteps, and the distant muffled sounds of 1,000 different lives happening behind identical looking doors. You quickly realize that the ship is split into a very specific social geography. You, as a single man, are relegated to the bow, the very front of the ship. The single women and families are tucked away in the stern, at the very back. This was done to keep things respectable, which is a polite way of saying the White Star Line didn't want any unsupervised romantic subplots developing in the middle of the North Atlantic. To get from the front to the back, you have to navigate a series of stairs, gates, and corridors that seem designed to confuse the soul. Historians still argue whether the complexity of this layout was a deliberate attempt to discourage class mingling or simply a byproduct of cramming maximum efficiency into the hull's curves. Either way, it works. You feel like a mouse in a very expensive, very buoyant laboratory. The lighting down here is fascinating in its own clinical way. The electric bulbs are spaced out just far enough to create pockets of shadow between them, giving the hallways a flickering, cinematic quality. You pass a steward carrying a stack of linens that's taller than he is. He moves with a grace that suggests he's developed sea legs before the ship even left the harbor. You try to mimic his walk, but the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of the ship makes you look like you've had one too many of those Irish coffees the brothers back in the cabin were talking about. A quirky fringe tidbit you might not know is that because of the massive language barriers, remember there are over a dozen different nationalities down here, the stewards often had to use a system of hand gestures and color coding to keep people moving in the right direction. Some hallways were subtly marked with different shades of trim to help non-English speakers find their way back to their sections. It's a bit like following the colored lines on a hospital floor, except if you get lost here, you might accidentally end up in the boiler room, or, God forbid, a second-class lounge where the air smells like actual tea and the carpets don't feel like they were made of recycled sandpaper. You reach a set of heavy iron gates. These aren't the ornate decorative gates you see in the movies. These are practical, sturdy barriers designed to comply with US immigration laws. The idea was that passengers had to be kept separate to prevent the spread of foreign diseases before they reached Ellis Island. It's a sobering thought. Even as you're traveling on the world's most advanced machine, you're still being treated like a potential biohazard. You peer through the bars. Beyond them, the hallway looks much the same, but you know that on the other side, the mattresses are probably made of actual feathers and the tea doesn't taste like it was brewed in a coal bucket. The smell changes as you move deeper into the labyrinth. Near the stairs, you get a waft of the kitchens. Heavy, fatty scent of roasting mutton and thick gravy. It's a welcome change from the new paint and oil scent of the corridors. But then, as you pass a ventilation shaft, you get a blast of hot, soot-heavy air from the stokehold far below. It's a reminder that beneath your feet, hundreds of men are working in a literal hellscape of fire and sweat to keep this floating city moving. You can hear the faint, rhythmic clack-clack of the coal shovels, a mechanical heartbeat that never stops. It's easy to forget about the black gang down in the boilers when you're staring at the shiny white walls, but the smell of burning carbon always brings you back to reality. You find a small, recessed area with a wooden bench. It's one of the few places where the hallway widens enough for two people to pass without performing an accidental tango. You sit down for a moment just to absorb the sheer shipness of it all. To your left, a young girl is teaching her younger brother how to say New York in English. They are Swedish, their voices soft and melodic against the industrial hum of the ship. It's a poignant scene, a tiny bubble of human hope in the middle of a massive steel machine. You realize that This labyrinth isn't just a series of hallways, it's a collection of dreams all moving toward the same distant horizon. As you prepare to head back toward your cabin, assuming you can remember which of the 3 dozen identical corridors leads to the bow, you catch a glimpse of your reflection in a polished brass fire extinguisher. You look a bit disheveled, your eyes a little wide from the sensory input. You've only been on board for a few hours, but you already feel like the Titanic has claimed you. You are part of its ecosystem now. You start the long trek back, keeping an eye out for the red trim that hopefully marks the way to the men's quarters. Remember that vibrating bunk we talked about? Suddenly, it's starting to sound like the most comfortable place on earth. At least there, the walls are only 3 feet apart and you know exactly where you are. As you turn another corner that looks exactly like the last 5, you can't help but chuckle at the irony. You're on the most famous ship in history and you're currently lost on the way to your own bedroom. Let's just hope the dining saloon is easier to find tomorrow, or you'll be surviving on nothing but the scent of boiled mutton and sheer willpower. Eventually, the maze of clinical white corridors spills you out into the general room, and the transition is like walking from a silent film into a high-octane rock concert. If the cabins were the sleep mode of the Titanic, this is the social battery at full charge. Imagine your favorite local dive bar on a Friday night, then compress it into a room paneled in sturdy, bright pine and fill it with people from every corner of the globe who are all collectively vibrating with the same nervous, hopeful energy. This is the heart of the third-class community. It's loud, it's chaotic, and it smells exactly like what you'd expect when you put several hundred people who haven't had a proper shower in 3 days into a room with 0 windows and a lot of very strong tobacco. The first thing that hits you, besides the wall of sound, is the visual contrast. While the first-class passengers are currently surrounded by mahogany, silk tapestries, and enough gold leaf to make a dragon jealous, you are surrounded by pine. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit for you. The White Star Line didn't just give you raw pine and tell you to deal with it. They actually had craftsmen paint the pine with a graining technique to make it look like expensive oak. It's the 1912 version of fake it till you make it. Or like buying a phone case that looks like marble, but is definitely just $5 plastic from a mall kiosk. It's a bit of a cheeky touch, a way of saying, we know you aren't the Duke of Marlborough, but we'll give you a room that feels slightly more expensive than a barn. You scan the room, looking for a place to sit, but every bench is packed. This is the ultimate no reserve seating nightmare. It's like a modern-day airport terminal during a blizzard. Only everyone is dressed in heavy wool coats and nobody is staring at a screen. Instead, they are staring at each other. Or more accurately, they are shouting over each other. You see a group of Italians in one corner, their hands moving faster than the ship's propellers as they argue over a game of cards. In another corner, a man is playing a fiddle, the melody sharp and fast, cutting through the low hum of the engines. Historians still argue whether the social segregation on board actually bothered the passengers or if they were simply happy to have better conditions than their homes, but looking around this room, nobody seems to be mourning the lack of a crystal chandelier. They are too busy being alive. The mainstream historical fact that always surprises people is that the Titanic's third class actually had a piano. Yes, a real upright piano. It wasn't a Steinway, and it had probably been through a few rough crossings on other ships, but it was there. In 1912, a piano was a massive symbol of status and civilization. Providing one for the steerage was the White Star Line's way of proving they were the luxury line for everyone, not just the millionaires. Right now, someone is banging out a popular music hall tune, and even though the piano is slightly out of tune, likely due to the constant humidity and the ship's vibrations, it provides a rhythmic backbone to the chaos. It's the 1912 version of a communal Spotify playlist, only you can't skip the tracks you don't like. You finally find a sliver of space on a wooden bench next to a man who looks like he's been carved out of a piece of old driftwood. He offers you a nod and a puff of his pipe, which smells like a campfire that's been put out with old socks. The smoke in the room is thick enough to be considered a physical inhabitant. Everyone is smoking, pipes, cigars, hand-rolled cigarettes. It's a hazy blue fog that hangs just below the ceiling. If you were to walk into this room today, the smoke detectors would be screaming before you even got your coat off. But here, it's just a scent of relaxation. It's an olfactory landscape of burnt cherry wood, heavy shag tobacco, and the underlying metallic tang of the ship itself. As you sit there, you notice the 1912 Tinder experience. It's basically just people staring intensely at each other from across the room because there's literally nothing else to do. You see a young man trying to impress a girl by showing her how he can balance a spoon on his nose. Truly, the peak of Edwardian flirting. If he had an Instagram, he'd probably be posting vibe check from the North Atlantic, but for now, he just has a spoon and a dream. You can't help but smile. Despite the cramped quarters and the fact that you're all currently floating in a giant iron pot over a 2-mile deep abyss, there's an incredible sense of camaraderie. You're all in the same boat, quite literally. The floor beneath you is that same red and white linoleum, and as the ship takes a gentle roll, you see a stray beer bottle slide slowly from one side of the room to the other. Nobody reaches for it, they just watch it go, a tiny glass pendulum marking the movement of the ocean. The noise level is fascinating. It's a cacophony of at least half a dozen languages: Swedish, Gaelic, Arabic, French, all blending into a singular human roar. It's a reminder that the Titanic wasn't just a British ship, it was a floating microcosm of the Great Migration. You realize that you probably have more in common with the Swedish farmer sitting across from you than you do with the first-class passengers sitting 4 decks above your head. The light in the general room is bright, perhaps too bright. The White Star Line wanted to emphasize the modernity of the ship, so they packed it with as many electric bulbs as the generators could handle. It gives the room a slightly surreal, stage-like quality. You feel like you're in a play and everyone has a role. There's the wise old man, the excited youth, and the overwhelmed mother, trying to keep 3 toddlers from climbing the fake oak walls. It's a high-energy, environment that is the polar opposite of the sleepy, sterile hallways you just left. You decide to lean back against the vibrating wall, closing your eyes for a moment. The sound of the fiddle, the shouting, the laughter, and the rhythmic thud of the engines all start to merge into a single, white noise hum. It's oddly comforting. In a world before the internet, this was how you stayed connected. You didn't scroll, you talked. You didn't like a post, you laughed at a joke. You realized that while you might be in the cheapest seats on the ship, you've arguably got the best atmosphere. Upstairs, they're probably arguing over which fork to use for the fish course, while down here, someone is currently teaching a group of strangers how to dance a jig in a space the size of a bathtub. As the night wears on, the energy in the general room starts to shift from frantic to mellow. The fiddle player packs up his instrument, the spoon flirt finally gives up and heads to his cabin, and the thick clouds of smoke begin to drift toward the ventilation shafts. You realize it's time to head back to your own seaweed mattress. You stand up, feeling a bit wobbly, not from the alcohol, because third class was strictly limited in that department, but from the sheer sensory overload. You take one last look at the fake oak walls and the out-of-tune piano. It's not much, but for tonight, it's enough. You head back into the white labyrinth, the sound of the general room fading behind you, replaced once again by the lonely, metallic heartbeat of the great ship. As you step back into the flow of the hallways, you realize that the Titanic isn't just a ship. It is a floating tower of Babel, only with more brass fittings and significantly more wool. It's like a 1912 version of a chaotic group chat where everyone is using a different emoji set and nobody can find the mute button. You find yourself navigating through a dense crowd of people who look like they've been plucked from every postcard in Europe and the Middle East. You've got Scandinavian farmers in heavy, hand-knitted sweaters that look like they could withstand a nuclear winter, Lebanese merchants in fine silks tucked under sturdy coats, and Russian families whose furs are so thick they probably have their own localized weather systems. It's a sensory explosion. The visual contrast is staggering. One moment you're passing a woman in a traditional Greek headscarf, and the next you're nodding to a young man from London who looks like he's trying very hard to pretend he's not terrified of the ocean. The mainstream historical fact that often gets lost in the Leo and Kate romance of it all is that the Titanic carried passengers from over 30 different countries. In third class alone, there were more than 700 people. And at any given moment, you could hear upwards of 20 different languages bouncing off those white painted steel walls. It's a linguistic soup. You walk past a group of Swedes having a heated discussion that sounds like a melodic song, only to be nearly run over by a group of Italian men who are using their hands to speak so vibrantly. You're worried they might accidentally punch a hole in the hull. It's the ultimate melting pot, but without the benefit of Google Translate. You realize very quickly that if you want to know where the nearest bathroom is, you have to become an expert in the high-stakes game of charades. Pointing, nodding, and frantic miming of "I need to wash my face" becomes your primary mode of communication. It's basically a silent movie, only with much higher stakes and a lot more vibrating floorboards. The smell here is a fascinating, multi-layered tapestry of human existence. It's not just the ship smell anymore. As you move through the clusters of people, you catch the sharp, garlicky scent of Mediterranean snacks, the smoky aroma of Central European tobacco, and the faint, sweet smell of orange peel from a child's pocket. It's an olfactory map of the world. If you close your eyes, you could probably track the migration patterns of the early 20th century just by sniffing the air. It's the authentic smell of 70 different types of travel-worn laundry and 1,000 different dreams. It reminds you of a modern international airport terminal during a holiday rush, if that terminal also served boiled mutton and didn't have any Wi-Fi. You start to feel a strange sense of perspective. To the people in first class, you're just the masses, but down here, you can see the individual threads of every story. Everyone is running away from something or toward something else, and in this cramped, vibrating space, those reasons don't matter as much as a shared experience of being here. Speaking of specialized needs, here is a quirky fringe tidbit you might not expect from a British steamship company in 1912. The Titanic actually had a dedicated kosher kitchen and a specialized Hebrew cook. For the large number of Jewish immigrants traveling from Eastern Europe, the White Star Line provided separate plates and utensils, all marked to ensure they followed dietary laws. It was a level of cultural sensitivity that was actually quite progressive for the time, likely driven by the fact that the White Star Line wanted to dominate the immigrant market by being the most hospitable option. You pass by the area where this food is prepared and catch a whiff of something that smells distinctly different from the standard British fare. It's a small detail, but it's a reminder that this ship was designed to be a home for everyone, even if that home came with a very strict hierarchy and a lot of locked gates. As you lean against a railing, watching the diverse crowd shuffle by, you can't help but think about what's driving all these people. This leads us to a point where historians still argue whether the primary driver for these third-class passengers was the pull of American opportunity or the push of European upheaval. Were they attracted by the mythical streets paved with gold, or were they simply fleeing the crushing weight of old-world poverty and rising political tensions? Looking at the faces around you, the tired eyes of a father holding his sleeping son, the nervous excitement of a young woman clutching her dowry in a small wooden box, you realize the answer is probably both. They are all gamblers, and their stake is their very lives. They've traded everything they know for a bunk bed made of seaweed and the hope that the person they meet on the other side of the Atlantic will be a better version of themselves. You see a group of children playing a game with a piece of string in the middle of the hallway. They don't seem to care that they speak 3 different languages between them. They found a universal tongue in the form of a cat's cradle. It's a moment of pure, unadulterated human connection that makes the steel walls of the Titanic feel a little less cold. You realize that while the ship is a marvel of engineering, its true heart is this messy, loud, multilingual community. It's a United Nations of unwashed wool, and despite the sarcasm you might feel about the lack of personal space, there's an undeniable beauty in it. You're part of a historical moment, a grand experiment in human migration that will define the coming century. Of course, the reality check hits when you realize that even in this melting pot, people are still clustering with their own. The Irish are near the Irish, the Syrians near the Syrians. It's human nature to seek out the familiar when you're literally in the middle of nowhere. You find yourself nodding to a fellow English speaker, feeling a sudden, intense burst of kinship, just because you both know what a crumpet is. It's funny how the world shrinks when you're on a boat. The vast differences of the continents fade away, replaced by the immediate, pressing reality of who is sharing your breathing space. You're all just atoms in the great steel molecule of the Titanic, bouncing off each other in the dark. The light in this part of the ship is a bit softer now, the electric bulbs beginning to hum with a slightly lower frequency as the evening wears on. The vibrant energy of the afternoon is settling into a quiet, murmuring exhaustion. You watch a man from a small village in Poland try to explain to a steward that he's lost his cabin key, using nothing but exaggerated hand motions and a look of pure desperation. The steward, who has clearly dealt with this 10 times already today, just sighs and gestures for the man to follow him. It's a small drama in a sea of thousands, a tiny reminder of the friction that comes when the world tries to fit through a single doorway. You take a deep breath, the air tasting of sea salt and old wool, and prepare to move on. You've seen the world today without even leaving the G deck. It's a lot to process, and your brain feels a bit like that out-of-tune piano in the general room, overwhelmed, a bit clunky, but still playing a melody that sounds like hope. Your stomach lets out a growl that rivals the rumble of the engines, reminding you that you haven't eaten since that questionable meat pie on the Southampton pier. Just then, the sound of a brass bell clanging echoes through the corridor. It's not the refined, musical chime of a dinner gong they use for the first class. It's a sturdy, no-nonsense, get over here or starve kind of ring. You follow the crowd toward the third-class dining saloon, located midship on F deck. Entering this space is like walking into a massive, white-painted high school cafeteria. If that cafeteria were currently being shaken by a giant and smelled intensely of boiled mutton and fresh yeast. It is bright, functional, and surprisingly clean. You see long communal tables with chairs that are actually bolted to the floor. A gentle reminder that if the North Atlantic decides to get rowdy, your chair won't be joining the party in the opposite corner of the room, the mainstream historical fact that might shock modern listeners is that the food for Titanic's third class was actually superior to what many of the passengers ate in their daily lives. On most other ships of the era, you had to bring your own food or settle for a bucket of salt beef that was older than you were. On the Titanic, the White Star Line provided 3 hot meals a day. You find a spot on a hard wooden bench and look at the table. There are no menus. That's a luxury for the people upstairs who need to know exactly which part of the cow they are eating, but the spread is impressive nonetheless. There's fresh bread, real butter, and a bowl of steaming porridge that looks thick enough to patch a hole in the hull. The air in the saloon is a thick, humid fog of culinary scents. It's a heavy, comforting aroma of roasted meats, boiled potatoes, and the sweet biscuity scent of freshly baked cabin biscuits. These biscuits are the 1912 version of a protein bar, only they have the structural integrity of a brick and the flavor profile of a very clean sidewalk. You dip one into your soup to soften it, and as you take a bite, you realize it's actually not bad. Compared to the modern world, where we pay $18 for an artisanal oats bowl at a trendy brunch spot, this 1912 steerage porridge is a bargain. It's the original overnight oats, just without the Instagram filter and with a lot more iron ore dust from the ventilation shafts. If you could package this vibe today, you'd probably call it industrial rustic and charge a premium for the lack of privacy. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit for you. While the first class was dining on 10-course meals featuring plover's eggs and pâté de foie gras, the third class was being introduced to a new delicacy, the baked potato. To many of the passengers from Eastern Europe or the Middle East, the way the British prepared potatoes was a novelty. There are stories of passengers trying to eat the skin like an apple or being confused by the lack of heavy spices. You watch an elderly man next to you poke at a piece of boiled beef with the suspicion usually reserved for a ticking bomb. He's from a village where everything was spiced with cumin and peppers, and here he is facing the ultimate challenge, British seasoning, which is to say, a light dusting of salt and the memory of a peppercorn. The social atmosphere in the dining saloon is a step up from the chaos of the general room. Because everyone is sitting down and focused on the task of refueling, the noise drops from a roar to a steady hum of clinking cutlery and murmuring voices. You find yourself sharing a pitcher of water with a young couple from Norway. You don't speak a word of Norwegian, and they don't speak English, but the universal language of pass the salt works perfectly. There's something deeply human about eating in a crowd like this. You're all sharing the same fuel, being powered by the same kitchen, and heading toward the same destination. It makes the G deck feel a little less like a prison and a little more like a village. Historians still argue whether the menu provided to the Board of Trade was an accurate representation of what was actually served, or if it was a bit of clever public relations by the White Star Line to make their steerage conditions look better on paper. Some survivors recalled the food being plentiful but plain, while others spoke of it as a feast. Looking at your plate, you think the truth is somewhere in the middle. The beef is a bit chewy, and the cabbage has been boiled into a state of submission that would make a pacifist proud, but it's hot, it's filling, and it's served on clean plates. You aren't eating off your lap in a dark corner, you're sitting at a table with a white tablecloth. Okay, it's probably a heavy-duty oilcloth made to look like linen, but it's the thought that counts. As you eat, you notice the rhythmic slosh of the water in your glass. The ship is moving through a calm sea, but there's a gentle, persistent roll that makes the soup in your bowl tilt toward the rim and then back again. It's a rhythmic, hypnotic dance. You have to time your spoonfuls with the movement of the ship, which is a bit like a low-stakes game of operation. If you miss the timing, you end up with a lap full of mutton broth. It's your first real lesson in sea legs. You realize that even your most basic biological functions, like eating, are now dictated by the whims of the Atlantic. You're no longer a land creature. You're a guest of the ocean, and the ocean has a very specific way of doing things. The dessert arrives, and it's a revelation. Plum pudding with sweet sauce. It's a dense, dark, sticky mass of fruit and sweet that feels like it could survive a trip to Mars and back. It's the ultimate comfort food. As you take a spoonful, the sugar hits your system and the world feels a little brighter. You remember that seaweed mattress waiting for you in the cabin? It doesn't seem so bad now that you have a stomach full of pudding. You see a group of kids at the next table fighting over a piece of fruit. In 1912, a fresh orange was a luxury, a burst of sunshine in the middle of a gray ocean. Watching them laugh and scramble for the peel, you're reminded that despite the brutal reality of the third class, there are moments of genuine joy. As the meal winds down, the stewards begin the efficient process of clearing the tables. They move like a well-oiled machine, stacking plates and wiping surfaces with a speed that suggests they have a very short window before the next shift starts. You stand up, feeling a bit heavy and very sleepy. The warmth of the dining saloon, the hum of the crowd, and the steady vibration of the floor have combined to create a powerful sedative. You start the trek back to your section, passing the familiar fake oak paneling of the general room. The smell of the food lingers in the hallway, a ghost of gravy and steamed pudding that follows you all the way back to your door. You've survived your first major meal on the unsinkable ship, and honestly, if this is a struggle, you've had worse Mondays back home. You slip back into your cabin, the Irishman is already snoring, and you find that the rhythmic thud-thud of the engine sounds a lot like a lullaby when you're full of plum pudding. The plum pudding is doing its best to settle in your stomach, but as you navigate back toward the bow, you are hit with a realization that usually strikes about 48 hours into any camping trip or music festival. You really, really need a wash. Now, in the modern world, we take for granted the idea that we can just step into a glass-enclosed box, turn a knob, and be pelted by piping hot water until our skin turns a healthy shade of lobster. If your Airbnb doesn't have a rainfall showerhead, you're probably leaving a scathing 3-star review. But on the Titanic, the brutal reality of third-class hygiene is enough to make a modern germaphobe faint on the spot. You see, for the 700 plus people currently calling steerage home, there are exactly 2 bathtubs. Not 2 per deck, not 2 per hallway, 2 total. 1 for the men and 1 for the women. It is the ultimate test of patience, and quite frankly, the math is terrifying. If you were to divide the total voyage, time by the number of passengers, you'd find that your scheduled slot for the tub would probably fall somewhere around mid-July, 3 months after the ship was supposed to dock in New York. This leads us to the mainstream historical fact that is often cited to illustrate the class divide. 2 tubs for 700 people in third class, while the first class had access to a Turkish bath, a swimming pool, and private ensuite facilities that probably saw more hot water in an hour than you'll see in a lifetime. It's like waiting in line for a single porta potty at Coachella, except everyone is wearing wool suits and the festival lasts for a week. You quickly realize that if you want to stay clean, you're going to have to become a master of the sponge bath using the tiny folding porcelain sink in your cabin. The smell in the vicinity of the public baths is unique. It's a humid, heavy cocktail of carbolic soap, which smells like a mixture of pine needles and industrial strength floor cleaner, blended with the damp, earthy scent of wet wool and the unmistakable aroma of humanity. In 1912, people didn't wash their clothes every day, and they certainly didn't have Febreze. Your heavy tweed coat is a sponge for every smell you've encountered since Southampton: coal smoke, mutton gravy, and the sweat of 1,000 dreams. Historians still argue whether the White Star Line considered this hygienic enough by the standards of the time, or if they were deliberately cutting corners on plumbing to save space for more lucrative cargo. Some argue that by 1912 standards, providing any bathtubs at all for steerage was considered a progressive move toward public health. Either way, looking at the line of men standing outside the single bathroom door, you decide that slightly crusty is going to be your aesthetic for the rest of the voyage. A quirky fringe tidbit about these bathtubs is that they were often supplied with salt water. Yes, you heard that right. Fresh water was a precious commodity on a steamship because it had to be carried in tanks or distilled from the boilers, and using it for 2,200 people to bathe would have been an engineering nightmare. So, if you were lucky enough to win the bathroom lottery and get a turn in the tub, you'd be soaking in warmed up North Atlantic seawater. It's basically like being a very large, very clean piece of pasta. The soap provided, Lifebuoy was the big brand back then, was specially formulated to lather in salt water, but it still left a fine, itchy crust of salt on your skin once you dried off. It's the 1912 version of an exfoliating sea salt scrub, only instead of a luxury spa treatment, it just makes you feel like you've been licked by a giant, salty dog. You stand near the communal washroom for a moment, watching a steward emerge with a bucket of gray water. The sound of dripping water echoing against the steel walls is surprisingly loud in the narrow corridor. You look at your hands and realize they are covered in a fine layer of soot from the ventilation system. The ship is a living, breathing machine, and it's a messy one. You decide to head back to your cabin and make use of the folding basin. It's a humbling experience. You have to fill the small carafe from a communal tap in the hall, bring it back, and then perform a sort of rhythmic standing-up cat wash. It's like trying to shower in a phone booth while someone is shaking the booth from the outside. You have to balance the water usage carefully. Splash too much and you will soak your seaweed mattress, which, as we've established, already smells like a tide pool at low afternoon. The light in the washroom area is that same clinical, buzzing electric glow. It doesn't do anyone's complexion any favors. You catch a glimpse of yourself in a small, slightly fogged up mirror. You look a bit wild-eyed, your hair matted by the humidity and the vibration. You look like someone who is halfway through an epic journey, which you are. You try to use a bit of the powdered dry shampoo of the era, which is basically just scented talcum powder, but it just makes you look like you've had a run-in with a flour bag. You give up and decide that the distressed immigrant look is actually quite trendy. After all, everyone else on this deck looks exactly the same. There's a certain freedom in the lack of hygiene. When everyone smells like a damp sheep, nobody really notices that you do too. You realize that for the wealthy upstairs, cleanliness is next to godliness. But for you, cleanliness is just a logistical nightmare. They have bath stewards who prepare their tubs with the perfect temperature and scent. You have a line of 20 angry men and a tap that occasionally spits out rust. It's a stark reminder of the social hierarchy. The Titanic is a vertical map of human value, and you are currently very close to the bottom. But even so, there's a weird pride in the steerage struggle. You're toughing it out. You're becoming part of the ship's grit. You imagine the first-class passengers in their silk robes and you think, sure, they smell like lavender, but do they have the character building of a saltwater sponge bath? Probably not. They're missing out on the authentic experience. As you walk away from the bathroom line, you pass a young woman who is trying to wash her toddler's face with a damp rag. The child is wailing, the sound echoing off the rivets. It's a small, domestic moment that feels incredibly out of place in this massive iron hull. It hits you that for many mothers in third class, the lack of hygiene facilities isn't just an inconvenience, it's a constant battle for dignity. Keeping a family clean in these conditions is a full-time job. You offer a sympathetic nod, but she's too focused on the soap and water struggle to notice. You move on, the rhythmic thump of the engines once again becoming the dominant sound. You finally get back to your cabin, feeling slightly more human after your makeshift wash. The Irish brothers are back, and one of them is trying to shave using a small, terrifyingly sharp straight razor. He's timing his strokes with the vibration of the ship. Shave, vibrate, shave, vibrate. It's like watching a high-stakes circus act. If he misses the rhythm, he's going to arrive in New York with one less ear. Careful there, you mutter, and he just laughs, a flash of white teeth in the dim light. If the ship can't kill me, a little blade won't either. It's that kind of bravado that keeps the third class going. You climb back into your bunk, the scent of the seaweed mattress now competing with the sharp tang of carbolic soap. You're clean enough for now. You close your eyes, the image of those two lone bathtubs fading as you drift toward sleep, wondering if the people in first class ever realize how much effort it takes just to not be covered in soot. You are lying back on that seaweed-stuffed mattress, trying to find a position that doesn't involve a dried kelp branch poking you in the kidney. The Irish brother with the razor has finally put his blade away, and the cabin is plunged into a darkness so thick you can practically feel it against your skin. But while the light is gone, the silence is nowhere to be found. In the modern world, we pay good money for white noise machines that mimic the sound of a gentle rain or a distant fan to help us drift off. We have noise-canceling headphones that can turn a screaming jet engine into a polite whisper. But here, in the bowels of the Titanic, you're currently sleeping inside the world's largest, loudest mechanical heart. There is no off switch, no volume slider, and certainly no sleep timer. You have to learn to embrace the symphony of the machine, or you're going to spend the next 5 nights staring at the ceiling until your eyes burn. The sound isn't just a noise, it's a physical entity. It starts as a low, guttural growl that seems to vibrate the very air in your lungs. This is the sound of the Titanic's 2 massive reciprocating engines, the largest ever built at the time, standing 4 stories tall, churning away just a few bulkheads away. It's a rhythmic thump hiss that follows a perfect mathematical cadence. To a modern ear, it sounds like sleeping inside a giant steam-powered grandfather clock that's been submerged in a bathtub. It's a mainstream historical fact that these engines were the pinnacle of Edwardian engineering, capable of pushing 50,000 tons of steel through the water at 22 knots. For you, however, they are just the noisy neighbors who won't stop practicing the drums at 2 a.m. And then there's the vibration. Because third class is located right over the propeller shafts in the stern, the shaking is relentless. It's not a violent jarring, but a high-frequency jitter that makes everything in the cabin dance. You look at the small porcelain wash basin in the corner. Remember the one that looks like a toothless mouth? In the faint light reflecting from the hallway, you can see the water inside it rippling in perfect concentric circles. It's like that scene in a dinosaur movie where the water glass starts shaking before the T-Rex shows up, only the T-Rex is 46,000 tons of British pride, and it's never going to arrive. If you were staying in a modern hotel and the floor was vibrating like this, you'd be at the front desk demanding a refund and a free breakfast voucher. Here, the White Star Line probably would have charged you extra for the therapeutic massage, if they'd thought of it. It's a 1912 version of a vibrating magic fingers bed, but instead of a quarter, it costs you your sanity and a little bit of your dental enamel. Historians still argue whether the excessive vibration in the stern cabins contributed to a sense of unease or even structural fatigue over time, but for the passengers, it was just a titanic tremor. You find that if you press your head directly against the steel wall, the sound changes from a dull roar to a sharp metallic ringing. You can hear the individual parts of the ship talking to each other. You hear the groan of the hull plates as they resist the pressure of the Atlantic, the sharp clack of a valve closing, and the distant, muffled shouting of a stoker in the boiler rooms far below. It's a chaotic, industrial lullaby. You realize that the ship is alive. It's a breathing, sweating, screaming organism of iron and steam. The smell of the engines even makes its way into your cabin through the ventilation shafts. It's a heavy, oily scent, the aroma of hot grease, scorched metal, and wet steam. It's not entirely unpleasant in a grandfather's garage kind of way, but it's a constant reminder that you are only a few inches of steel away from a very cold, very deep ocean. It's a sharp contrast to the salty, fresh air on the upper decks. Down here, the air feels processed. It's been through the lungs of the ship, heated by the boilers, and pushed through miles of ductwork before it reaches your nose. It's a bit like the recycled air on a long-haul flight, only with more soot and significantly less pretzel smell. You try to time your breathing to the rhythm of the engines. In, hiss, out, thump. It's a form of mechanical meditation. Just as you're starting to find your groove, the Irish brother in the bunk above you lets out a snore that is so loud, so violently unrhythmic, that it shatters the industrial symphony. It sounds like a walrus trying to start a lawnmower. Now you have two competing sounds: the high-tech roar of the world's greatest ship and the low-tech honk of a man from County Cork. It's a battle for audio dominance. You find yourself rooting for the engines. At least the engines are predictable, a quirky fringe tidbit about life on these liners is that many third-class passengers actually felt landsick once the journey ended. They became so accustomed to the constant vibration and the rhythmic noise that once they stepped onto the solid, silent ground of New York, their bodies didn't know how to react. Their inner ears were still waiting for the thump hiss that never came. It's like that weird feeling you get after spending all day on a treadmill, where the world feels like it's moving beneath you, even when you're standing still. For now, though, you are very much sea sturdy. You've even learned how to keep your suitcase from sliding across the floor by wedging it against the base of the bunk with a spare pair of wool socks. The light bulb in the hallway flickers, casting long, jerky shadows across your cabin door. You watch a small spider crawl across the fake oak paneling. Even the spider seems to be struggling with the vibration, its little legs twitching as it tries to navigate the jittery wood grain. You wonder if the spider thinks it's on a giant vibrating flycatcher. You realize that you've become strangely protective of the ship's noise. It's the sound of progress. It's the sound of moving toward a new life. If the engine stopped, that would be the real reason to worry. Silence on the Titanic wouldn't be a luxury. It would be a catastrophe. You finally feel your muscles start to relax. Your brain has decided to filter out the roar, turning the massive reciprocating engines into a background hum no more intrusive than a modern-day refrigerator. You're floating on a cushion of steam and steel. The seaweed in your mattress doesn't feel quite so crunchy, and the Irishman's snoring has settled into a tolerable grunt. You are one with the machine. You are a tiny, sleeping component in a 50,000-ton experiment in physics and hope. As you finally drift off, the last thing you feel is that persistent, rhythmic thump in your heels. A heartbeat that promises you'll be hundreds of miles closer to America by the time the sun comes up. You wake up to a sound that isn't the rhythmic thrum of the engines or the Irishman snoring. It's a faint, skittering noise, like tiny fingernails tapping on a chalkboard. You open one eye and see a small gray shadow dart across the linoleum floor and vanish behind your suitcase. This brings us to a brutal reality that the White Star Line brochures conveniently forgot to mention. The Titanic, for all its grand titles and unsinkable branding, was a floating city, and every city has a rodent problem. You aren't just sharing your cabin with 3 other men, you're sharing it with an undisclosed number of furry stowaways. In 1912, rats on a ship were as common as crying babies on a budget airline today. Only the rats were generally quieter and better at social distancing. The smell in the cabin this morning is particularly vibrant. It's a mix of the usual suspects: damp wool, seaweed mattress, and oil. But now there's the added sharp, musky scent of rodent. It's an earthy, pungent aroma that reminds you of an old barn, which is exactly what the lower decks are starting to feel like. You realize that while the first-class passengers might have to deal with the occasional pest in the form of a pushy socialite, you are dealing with the genuine, four-legged variety. Historians still argue whether the Titanic's rat-proof bulkheads were actually effective or if the rats simply treated them like a fun obstacle course designed by the White Star Line to keep them in peak physical condition. Looking at the way that Shadow just moved, you're leaning toward the latter. They seem quite healthy on a diet of dropped cabin biscuits and sheer audacity. A mainstream historical fact that might surprise you is that rats were actually an accepted part of maritime life back then. Sailors didn't just tolerate them, they observed them. There was an old superstition that if the rats started leaving a ship, you should probably follow them, as they supposedly had a sixth sense for impending disaster. Right now, seeing a pair of beady eyes watching you from under the wash basin, you find very little comfort in this. You'd much rather the rats were packed up and headed for the lifeboats right now, but they seem perfectly content with their current real estate. They are the ultimate fringe passengers, traveling for free and enjoying the best heating system 1912 technology could provide. Speaking of uninvited guests, here's a quirky fringe tidbit. The Titanic actually had an official ship's cat named Jenny. She was transferred from the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, and she even had her own cabin in the galley. Some stories suggest that Jenny was seen carrying her kittens off the ship before it even left Southampton, which, if true, makes her the smartest passenger on board. But down here on the G deck, Jenny is nowhere to be found. You are the one in charge of pest control, which mostly involves throwing a stray boot in, the general direction of any movement and hoping for the best. It's like a very low stakes, very dark version of whack-a-mole, played in the middle of the night while you're half asleep. The light in the cabin is still dim, that single bulb looking more tired than you feel. You sit up and your head nearly makes acquaintance with the bottom of the Irishman's bunk. You reach for your boots, carefully shaking them out first, another habit you've picked up in just a few days. You don't want to find a hidden friend curled up in your toe box. As you pull them on, you notice the dust. The ventilation system that brings you air also brings a fine black soot from the coal-burning furnaces. It settles on everything. Your white shirt is now a fashionable industrial gray, and you probably have enough carbon in your lungs to start a small fire. If you were in 2026, you'd be checking the air quality index on your phone and considering a lawsuit. Here, you just wipe your face with your damp rag and accept that sooty is the color of progress. The social dynamic of the room changes when the others wake up. The Irishman, the one with the terrifying razor, sees you looking under the bed and laughs. Don't mind the little fellows, he says. They've got more right to be here than the taxman back home. There's a strange sense of humor that develops when you're living in a steel box. You start to find the absurdity of it all funny. You're on the most luxurious ship in the world, and you're currently negotiating territory with a mouse. It's a reality check that cuts right through the Gilded Age glamour. While the people upstairs are waking up to a steward bringing them tea and a fresh newspaper, you are waking up to the sound of a rodent eating your spare shoelace. The vibration of the ship seems to have picked up during the night. The thud-thud is faster now, a more insistent rhythm that makes the loose rivets in the wall rattle like a tambourine. You realize the ship is making time, pushing through the Atlantic with all the confidence of a Victorian gentleman walking through a park. You head out of the cabin, leaving your furry roommates behind. The hallway is already buzzing with the morning rush. The smell of frying bacon and coffee from the kitchens is starting to drift down, a glorious, smoky aroma that acts like a siren song for your hungry stomach. It's a sensory tug-of-war, the rat smell behind you and the bacon promise ahead of you. You pass a group of children who have caught one of the hidden friends and are keeping it in a small wooden box. They've named it Captain and are feeding it crumbs of bread. It's a bizarrely wholesome moment in a very unwholesome environment. You realize that for these kids, the rats aren't a sign of poor hygiene. They're just another part of the adventure. It reminds you how much of our reality is just how we choose to look at things. If you choose to see the Titanic as a palace, the rats are an insult. If you see it as a giant floating machine, the rats are just part of the ecosystem. You choose the latter mostly because it makes you feel less like you're living in a sewer and more like you're a character in a gritty adventure novel. As you reach the dining saloon, you take one last look back at the hallway. The white paint is starting to look a little scuffed, the linoleum a little worn. The ship is only a few days old, but with thousands of people living in its guts, it's already gaining character. You think about the hidden friends back in your cabin and wonder if they'll make it to New York too. Will they scurry off the gangway and start a new life in the Bronx? It's a funny thought. The Great Migration of 1912 wasn't just for humans, it was for anyone with the grit to survive the G deck. You step into the warmth of the dining saloon, the smell of coffee finally drowning out the memory of the mice, and prepare for another day on the unsinkable. Little do you know, the rats might be the only ones who actually see what's coming. The calendar has ticked over to Sunday, April 14th, 1912. It's late, somewhere around 11:40 p.m., and the air in your cabin has taken on a sharp, crystalline edge that wasn't there before. It's no longer just chilly, it's a kind of cold that feels like it's trying to pick the lock on your ribcage. You're huddled under that scratchy wool blanket, the seaweed in your mattress crunching every time you try to find a spot that doesn't smell like a harbor. The Irish brothers are out cold, their synchronized snoring creating a rhythmic counterpoint to the ever-present thump-thump of the engines. Everything feels normal. In fact, it's almost too normal. It's that eerie pre-dawn quiet you get in a modern suburb just before the garbage truck arrives. Only the garbage truck in this scenario is a black-blue mountain of ice weighing several million tons. Then it happens. You don't hear an explosion. There isn't a cinematic boom or the sound of rending metal like you'd hear in a summer blockbuster. Instead, there is a shudder. It's a strange, vibrating jolt that starts in the soles of your feet and travels up your spine. It's a 1912 version of your phone vibrating on a wooden nightstand. Only the nightstand is 882 feet long and made of steel. Imagine you're on a modern flight and the pilot hits a bit of light turbulence. The kind where they tell the flight attendants to take their seats and you briefly wonder if you should have finished that ginger ale. That's what this feels like. It's a hesitation in the ship's stride. You sit up in your bunk, your breath hitching in the freezing air. The vibration from the engine suddenly changes its frequency. It's no longer a confident, forward-moving hum. It's a confused, straining groan. This is a mainstream historical fact that often gets glossed over. The impact itself was so subtle that many people in the upper decks didn't even wake up. But down here in the bow, you're much closer. To the action. You heard a sound like someone dragging a giant piece of sandpaper across the side of a tin can. A long, drawn-out scrrrsh. It was the sound of the Atlantic Ocean being invited inside without an appointment. Historians still argue whether the iceberg caused a continuous 300-foot gash or if it was actually a series of small, intermittent popped rivets that allowed the water to spray in like a high-pressure hose. Regardless of the physics, the unsinkable Titanic has just received its first and final reality check. It's like buying a shatterproof screen protector for your phone and then watching it spiderweb into 1,000 pieces the first time you drop it on a carpeted floor. The irony is thick enough to drown in, though you don't know that just yet. To you, it's just a weird noise on a very cold night. You look over at the Irishman in the bunk across from you. He hasn't even stirred. He's dreaming of Chicago, probably, or maybe just dreaming of a breakfast that doesn't involve boiled mutton. You feel a sudden urge to check the hallway. You slide out of bed, your bare feet hitting the red linoleum, which now feels like a sheet of dry ice. You crack the door open and look out. The white corridor is still bathed in that humming electric light, but the silence is starting to feel heavy. There are no alarms, no sirens. In 1912, emergency procedures for third-class passengers mostly consisted of wait until someone tells you what to do, which is a bit like waiting for a software update on a 2005 laptop. It's going to take forever, and there's a high chance the whole system will just crash anyway. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit that highlights the sheer absurdity of the moment. While you're standing there in your long johns, some third-class passengers who were in the common areas actually started playing soccer with the chunks of ice that had fallen onto the forward well deck. They were laughing, kicking around bits of the North Atlantic as if they'd just been given a free delivery from a high-end cocktail lounge. To them, the iceberg wasn't a threat. It was a souvenir. They had no idea that the souvenir was currently filling the mailroom and the boiler sections with freezing seawater at a rate of 7 tons per second. The smell in the hallway has changed, too. The usual scent of oil and paint has been cut through by something sharp and metallic. It's the smell of the deep ocean, a cold, briny, mineral scent that shouldn't be inside a steel corridor. It's like opening a freezer that hasn't been cleaned in a decade. It's a smell that feels old. You realize that the vibration has stopped entirely. This is the part that truly unnerves you. For 4 days, the thump thump of the engines has been your heartbeat. Now, the heart has stopped. The silence is absolute, save for the faint, distant sound of steam being vented from the funnels. A high-pitched screaming whistle that sounds like the ship is letting out a final, desperate sigh. You step back into the cabin and shake the Irishman's shoulder. "Something's happened," you whisper. He grumbles, squinting at you in the dim light. "Go back to sleep, lad," he mutters. "It's probably just the Iceman making a delivery." You want to believe him. You want to believe that the most expensive machine in history can handle a little scrape. But then, you look at the bottom of your cabin door. You see a thin, dark line of water beginning to creep across the red linoleum. It's moving slowly, almost hesitantly, like it's exploring its new surroundings. It's not a flood yet, it's just a puddle. But in that puddle, you see the reflection of the single electric bulb, and the light is flickering. You realize that this is the brutal reality moment. Up in first class, they might be getting their life jackets adjusted by polite stewards who assure them it's all just a precautionary drill. Down here, you're watching the ocean walk into your bedroom. You start to pull on your heavy coat, your fingers fumbling with the buttons. You remember the locked gates, the labyrinth of hallways, and the fact that you haven't seen a single crew member since the shutter. You're in a steel box, several feet below the waterline, and the music has stopped. It's the ultimate vibe shift, moving from a sleepy Sunday night to a fight for survival in the span of 10 minutes. As you wake your other roommates, the ship gives a slight, almost imperceptible tilt to the bow. It's like the ship is nodding its head, acknowledging that the Atlantic has won. You look at your suitcase, the one with all your dreams for New York, and for the first time, you realize that you might have to leave it behind. The water is now an inch deep, soaking into the hem of your trousers. It's cold, so cold it feels like a physical burn. You grab your boots and your inspection card, the one that says you're clean and fit for America. You wonder if the ocean cares about inspection cards. You take a deep breath, the air tasting of salt and impending chaos, and step out into the hallway for real. The long climb is about to begin. The hallway is no longer a clinical, white-painted sanctuary of progress. It has become a flaring artery of confusion. As you wade through the ankle-deep water, which, by the way, feels like thousands of tiny needles stabbing your skin simultaneously, you realize that the orderly world of the Titanic has dissolved. People are spilling out of their cabins, rubbing sleep from their eyes, their faces reflecting the same, "Is this actually happening?" expression you'd see on someone watching their car get towed in real time. But there's a darker layer here. You reach the first set of heavy iron gates that separate third class from the rest of the ship, and you find them shut. Not just closed, but guarded. A steward stands on the other side, looking about as stressed as a guy trying to defuse a bomb with a pair of safety scissors. He's telling everyone to stay back, to wait for instructions that he clearly doesn't have himself. This brings us to one of the most controversial and heartbreaking aspects of the tragedy, a point where historians still argue whether the gates were kept locked specifically to prevent the lower classes from swamping the lifeboats, or if it was simply a rigid adherence to U.S. immigration laws that hadn't been updated for a sinking ship. Some argue it was a tragic bureaucratic failure, stewards following the book while the book was literally being swallowed by the sea. Either way, the brutal reality is that you are trapped in the belly of a sinking whale. It's like being stuck in a subway car during a power outage, except the car is slowly filling with liquid nitrogen and the emergency exit is 3 floors up and behind a locked cage. The mainstream historical fact is that the Titanic's layout was a nightmare for anyone trying to escape the lower decks. There were no direct routes to the boat deck for third-class passengers. You had to navigate a series of winding stairs, narrow corridors, and those infamous gates. It was a vertical maze designed to keep people in their place, and right now, your place is becoming a very expensive aquarium. You look around at the crowd gathered at the gate. It's that linguistic kaleidoscope again, but the music has turned into a discord of panic. You hear help in Italian, "Where do we go?" in Arabic, and "Open the door," in Swedish. The steward on the other side just shakes his head, his face pale under the flickering electric light. He looks like he's trying to maintain his dignity while the floor beneath him is literally tilting into the abyss. A quirky fringe tidbit that highlights the sheer chaos is that some passengers, realizing the stewards weren't going to help, started taking matters into their own hands. There are reports of men using heavy trunks as battering rams to smash through the wooden doors that led to second-class areas. It was the 1912 version of hacking the system, only instead of a computer code, they were using brute force and desperation. You see a group of men further down the hall eyeing a particularly sturdy-looking door. They aren't waiting for a software update from the bridge, they are opting for the manual override. It's a moment of raw human instinct. The realization that the rules of the society you were so desperate to join no longer apply when the water is reaching your knees. The smell here is no longer just salty. It's the smell of old dust being washed out of the ship's crevices, mixed with the sharp ozone scent of short-circuiting electrical wires. Every time a light bulb flickers and dies, there's a small pop and a puff of acrid smoke. It's an olfactory nightmare. The water itself has a greasy, metallic film on top of it, likely from the engine oils and coal dust it's picking up as it hunts through the ship. If you've ever been in a basement after a flood, you know that smell. It's the scent of things that are supposed to stay dry getting very, very wet. It's smell of a dream dissolving in real time. You find yourself standing next to a woman who is clutching two small children. She isn't shouting. She's just staring at the water with a look of profound, hollow realization. It's the kind of look that makes your heart feel like it's being squeezed by a cold hand. You realize that women and children first is a great sentiment, but it's hard to implement when you're behind a locked gate on G-Deck. You decide that waiting is no longer an option. You remember the Scotland Road corridor, the long internal highway. If you can get there, maybe there's a way up. You turn away from the gate, ignoring the steward's frantic shouts to stay in line. The irony isn't lost on you. The White Star Line spent a fortune making this ship feel like a luxury hotel, but they forgot to make the exits easy to find. It's like being in a giant casino where there are no windows and no clocks, designed to keep you inside and spending money, except the house is currently folding and the payout is a freezing death. You start to move back through the crowd, your heavy coat soaked at the bottom, making every step feel like you're wearing lead weights. You pass the general room where the out-of-tune piano is now partially submerged. A single bottle of beer, remember the one that was sliding across the floor, is now bobbing in the water like a tiny glass message in a bottle that nobody is ever going to read. You see a group of young men who have found a crew ladder, one of those narrow, vertical iron things used by stokers. It leads to a small hatch in the ceiling. One by one, they are hauling themselves up, their boots clanging against the metal. It's not a regulation escape route, but it's a way out. You join the line. The guy in front of you is a Syrian man who barely reaches your shoulder, but he's got the grip of a titan. He hauls himself up and then reaches back down to pull you. For a second, your eyes meet. You don't speak the same language, but in that moment, you are the same person. You are two atoms trying to escape a collapsing molecule. As you pull yourself up into the dark, cramped service trunk, you feel a sudden blast of fresh, freezing air. It's the first time you've smelled the actual ocean, not the processed version from the ventilation shafts. Since you left Southampton, it's sharp, it's clean, and it's terrifyingly cold. You realize you're no longer in the labyrinth, you're in the plumbing of the ship. Above you, you can hear the faint, haunting sounds of the band playing on the boat deck. They're playing ragtime. It's the 1912 version of lo-fi beats to sync Study 2. And the juxtaposition is so absurd you almost want to laugh. You keep climbing, your fingers numb as they grip the freezing iron rungs. Behind you, the water is still rising, a silent black predator that doesn't care about your class, your nationality, or your inspection card. You've broken through the first barrier, but the brutal reality is only just beginning to reveal its true scale. You haul yourself out of the service trunk and back onto a proper deck. But the world you've emerged into is unrecognizable. The clean, white-painted order of the Titanic is being swallowed by a literal and metaphorical slant. The floor beneath your boots is no longer level. It's tilted forward at an angle that makes you feel like you're walking up a steep hill in a dream where your legs are made of lead. You've bypassed the locked gates of the third class, but now you're in a confusing middle ground, E deck, or perhaps D deck. The walls here are more ornate, the lighting a bit warmer, but the atmosphere is pure, unadulterated dread. It's like breaking into a high-end department store after hours, only the store is currently being lowered into a giant bucket of ice water. The air here is a frantic mix of smells. You still have that metallic, briny scent of the rising Atlantic, but now it's clashing with the expensive perfumes and cigar smoke of the upper classes. It's a sensory collision of rich and ruined. You see people in silk robes and fur coats wandering the halls with the same dazed expression you saw in the G-deck corridors. Some are clutching jewelry boxes, others are holding nothing but a single shoe or a decorative pillow. Historians still argue whether the lack of a general alarm contributed to this surreal, slow-motion panic, but looking at the faces around you, it's clear that reality is finally sinking in, just like the ship. In 1912, there were no active shooter or fire drill protocols baked into the public consciousness. People were waiting for a civilized evacuation that simply wasn't coming. The mainstream historical fact that hits you now is the sheer inadequacy of the signage. Even here in the better parts of the ship, there are no glowing exit signs. If you didn't know the layout of the Titanic by heart, you were essentially playing a high-stakes game of Find the Sky. For a third-class passenger, this was the ultimate barrier. You're in a space where you don't belong, trying to find a route to a deck you've never been allowed to visit. It's like trying to find the penthouse of a skyscraper while the elevators are dead and the stairs are being moved by a mischievous ghost. Every time you turn a corner, you're met with a dead end or a steward who tells you to go back down and wait, but you've seen the water on G deck. You know that waiting is just a polite word for drowning. A quirky fringe tidbit about this stage of the sinking is that many people actually went down to their cabins to get their belongings, thinking they had plenty of time. You pass a man trying to drag a steamer trunk up a flight of stairs that is currently at a 15-degree angle. He's sweating, his face a mask of stubborn determination. He hasn't realized yet that in about an hour, that trunk will be nothing more than a very heavy piece of driftwood at the bottom of the ocean. It's a heartbreaking sight. The human instinct to cling to stuff, even when the world is ending. You want to tell him to leave it, but you don't have the words, and honestly, you don't have the time. You have to keep moving upward. The smell of the ship is becoming increasingly industrial again. As the bow sinks deeper, the internal pressure is causing air to be forced out of the lower compartments through the ventilation shafts. It's a hot, stale, oily breath that smells like the very soul of the Titanic is being exhaled. It's a mix of coal dust, steam, and the faint, charred scent of labor. You reach a wide staircase, not the grand staircase, but a sturdy secondary one. You start to climb, your heart hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. Every step feels like a victory over the North Atlantic. But then, you look over the railing and down into the stairwell. You see the water. It's no longer creeping. It's surging. It's a dark, swirling mass that looks like liquid. Obsidian, rising up the steps behind you with a terrifying, silent efficiency. You realize that the ship isn't just sinking, it's being reclaimed. The Titanic was built with the idea that nature could be partitioned off by watertight bulkheads, but the ocean is proving that it doesn't care about partitions. This leads to the point where historians still argue whether the watertight design actually hastened the sinking by keeping the water in the bow and causing the ship to trim down so sharply. From your perspective, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that the water is faster than you are. You scramble up the next flight of stairs, your boots slipping on the polished wood. The brutal reality of the climb is that it's a race you can't win, but you have to keep running anyway. The lighting is starting to fail. The brilliant electric glow that was once a symbol of the ship's majesty is now a dim, sickly yellow. The generators are struggling, their hum turning into a desperate, high-pitched whine. In the flickering light, you see shadows that seem to stretch and warp as the ship tilts further. You pass a second-class lounge where the furniture has started to slide. A heavy oak table drifts slowly across the carpet, pinning a chair against the wall with a dull thud. It's a weirdly domestic sound in the middle of a catastrophe. It reminds you of Moving Day, only the new, House is a 2-mile deep trench in the middle of the ocean. You finally reach a door that leads to the open air. As you push it open, the change in environment is violent. The freezing Atlantic air hits you like a physical blow, instantly turning the sweat on your forehead into ice. The sound is even more shocking. After the muffled, metallic groans of the interior, the outside is a cacophony of screaming steam, shouting voices, and the haunting, rhythmic music of the band. You are on the boat deck, or at least a promenade deck near it. The stars above are impossibly bright, looking like diamonds scattered on black velvet. It's a beautiful night, which makes the chaos on the deck feel even more like a hallucination. You look around and see the lifeboats, or rather, you see the lack of lifeboats. Even from here, you can see that the math doesn't work. There are too many people and too few white wooden boats. The brutal reality of 1912 safety regulations is laid bare under the starlight. You've finished the climb, you've beaten the maze, and you've escaped the rising water in the G deck. But as you stand there, shivering in your heavy coat, you realize that your reward for the long climb upward is simply a front row seat to the impossible. You aren't safe, you're just on a higher level of the disaster. You see a lifeboat being lowered, half empty, its pulleys creaking in the cold air. You start toward it, but a crewman blocks your path, his hand on a pistol holstered at his hip. "Women and children only, mate," he says, his voice flat and exhausted. You look back at the door you just came through and you can hear the water splashing against the wood from the other side. There is no going back. You stand on the deck, the freezing air of the North Atlantic clawing at your throat, and you finally see the math of survival laid out in cold, hard wood and canvas. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Titanic carried only enough lifeboats for about half of the people on board, 20 boats for over 2,200 souls. In the modern world, we have maximum occupancy signs on every elevator and fire codes that dictate exactly how many people can be in a Starbucks at one time. But in 1912, the British Board of Trade's regulations were based on the tonnage of the ship, not the number of passengers. They thought a ship this big was a lifeboat. Looking at the davits now, those giant iron cranes meant to lower the boats. You realize you've been invited to a game of musical chairs where half the chairs were never even brought to the party. The scene on the boat deck is a surreal, high-contrast nightmare. The brilliant white of the lifeboats glows under the electric lamps, while the sea below is a black, hungry void. The smell here is a biting mixture of ozone from the wireless room, the sulfurous tang of the distress flares being fired into the air, and the underlying scent of ice. It's a clean, sharp smell that feels like it's freezing your nostrils shut. Every few minutes, a loud boom echoes across the water as a rocket streaks into the sky, bursting into a shower of white stars. In any other context, it would be a celebration. Here, it's a scream for help that the horizon is ignoring. You watch a flare drift downward, its light reflecting off the unsinkable brass fittings of the ship, and you realize that even the most expensive light show in the world can't hide the fact that the deck is now tilting like a playground slide. Historians still argue whether the crew's insistence on women and children only versus women and children first cost hundreds of men their lives. In some parts of the ship, if there were no women present, the boats were lowered half empty rather than allowing men to board. You see this happening right in front of you. A lifeboat designed to hold 65 people is being cranked down with barely 30 people inside. It's the 1912 version of a logistics fail, a bug in the system that no one can patch in time. You try to move forward, but the brutal reality is that your third-class ticket acts like an invisible barrier, even here in the open air. You aren't being pushed back with bayonets, but the sheer, polite, firm mess of the system is keeping you on the fringes. A quirky fringe tidbit that adds to the absurdity. While people were literally fighting for their lives, some passengers were still worried about their social standing. There are accounts of men in first class refusing to get into a dirty lifeboat or complaining that the seats weren't cushioned. You see a woman clutching a Pekingese dog as if it were a child, while a few feet away, a mother from third class is being told she can't bring her teenage son. The dog gets a seat, the son stays on the deck. It's a moment of such profound unfairness that it makes your blood boil, even as the temperature around you drops toward zero. You realize that the Titanic is a microcosm of the world's cruelty, just condensed into a few hundred feet of sinking steel. The sound is what truly haunts you. It's not just the shouting, it's the band. They are still playing. They've moved their instruments onto the deck, and the jaunty notes of Alexander's ragtime band are clashing with the sound of the ship's own destruction. It's a psychological defense mechanism, a musical coat of paint over a crumbling wall. You can hear the groaning of the ship's frame, a deep metallic shriek as the stress of the water-filled bow begins to pull the stern out of the water. It's a sound like 1,000 cars being crushed at once, slow and deliberate. Every time the ship moans, the band plays a little louder. It's the ultimate "this is fine" meme, performed live by 8 men in wool suits who know they aren't getting off this ship. You look for your friends from the cabin, the Irish brothers, the silent Swede. They are nowhere to be seen. The labyrinth from earlier has done its job. It has separated everyone. You are a solitary atom again. You see a group of men trying to launch one of the collapsible boats, basically a raft with canvas sides. It's stuck. They are hacking at the ropes with pocket knives, their hands so numb they can barely grip the handles. It's a frantic, desperate struggle against a clock that is ticking in the form of rising water. You join them, pulling on a rope that feels like a frozen iron bar. For a moment, you feel a sense of purpose. If you can just get this boat into the water, maybe the math changes. Maybe there's a seat for you. The smell of the ocean is overwhelming now. It's not just salty anymore. It's the smell of a vast, indifferent power. It's the scent of the abyss. As you pull on the rope, you look over the side. The water is much closer now. The portholes of the lower decks are glowing beneath the surface like a row of sunken lanterns. The ship is a dying star, its light being squeezed out by the weight of the Atlantic. You realize that the math of survival isn't just about the number of boats, it's about time. And time is a luxury that the third class never really had. You've spent the last hour climbing, while the people on this deck have spent the last hour deciding whether or not they wanted to leave. One of the crewmen fires a warning shot into the air to keep the crowd from swamping the last boat. The crack of the pistol is sharp and final, cutting through the music and the steam. The civilized veneer is cracking. You see the panic in people's eyes, the realization that the unsinkable ship is gone and all that's left is the cold. You look at the lifeboat you were trying to help launch. It's been swept away by a sudden lurch of the ship, floating off upside down into the darkness. That was your seat. That was your chair in the game. You stand there, your hands raw and bleeding from the frozen ropes, and you realize that the math has finally reached zero. The ship gives a massive, shuddering lunge. The stern rises further, and you find yourself gripping a railing just to keep from sliding down the deck. The band has finally stopped playing. The silence that follows is more terrifying than any scream. You look up at the stars one last time, wondering if anyone in New York is looking at them too. You think about that seaweed mattress and the hidden friends back in the cabin. They're gone now, and you're about to follow. The brutal reality is that there were never enough chances to go around, and you are at the end of the line. You take a deep breath of the freezing air, bracing yourself for the plunge as the great black hull of the Titanic begins its final vertical journey toward the floor of the world. The deck beneath your feet is no longer a floor. It has become a wall. You are clinging to the mahogany railing of the stern with the desperation of someone holding on to a final, fleeting hope. This is the brutal reality reaching its crescendo. The Titanic, the 46,000-ton steel whale, is no longer a ship. It's a massive, vertical tombstone. You are hanging over a black abyss, and the stars above seem to be mocking you with their stillness. The silence that follows the stopping of the band is suddenly shattered by a sound that no human ear was ever meant to hear. It's a deep, gut-wrenching roar, a combination of thunder, grinding metal, and 1,000 glass windows, shattering simultaneously. This is the mainstream historical fact that was debated for decades until the wreck was found. The Titanic is breaking in two. The stress on the hull has reached its limit, and the great ship is snapping like a frozen twig between the third and fourth funnels. Imagine you're on the world's most terrifying theme park ride, but the safety harness has failed, and the exit is a 3-story drop into a bucket of ice. That's your current vibe. The lights, which have been glowing with a sickly, dying orange, suddenly flare into a brilliant, blinding white before vanishing into absolute darkness. The ship's internal battery has finally hit 0%, and there is no low power mode for a sinking ocean liner. Historians still argue whether the ship broke apart while still at a relatively shallow angle or if it had reached a terrifyingly steep vertical position before the keel finally gave way. From where you are, hanging onto the railing of the poop deck, it doesn't matter. The world has turned into a cacophony of screeching steel and the terrifying whoosh of air escaping from the lower compartments. The same air you were breathing just hours ago in your seaweed-stuffed bunk. The smell in these final moments is something you'll never forget, even if a forever only lasts another few minutes. It's a toxic, biting cocktail of sulfur from the dying boilers, the ozone of short-circuited electrical systems, and the sharp mineral scent of the deep Atlantic rising to meet you. It's the smell of a machine's death. And then there's the sound of the hidden friends. The thousands of objects inside the ship that are now falling through the length of the hull. Grand pianos, china plates, chandeliers, and the fake oak paneling of the general room are all succumbing to gravity, creating a muffled, metallic landslide inside the ship's belly. It's the 1912 version of a chaotic unboxing video, only everything is being unboxed by the force of physics and deposited into the dark. Then, the plunge happens. It's not a graceful descent. The stern, freed from the weight of the bow, settles back into the water for a moment before tilting upward again. You find yourself standing on the very edge of the hull, looking down at the white foam churning around the propellers. Those massive bronze blades that once pushed you toward a new life. They look like the petals of a giant frozen flower. And then, the water comes for you. It's not like a swimming pool, it's like a solid, living entity. As you lose your grip and slide into the dark, the first contact with the North Atlantic is a shock that transcends the word cold. It's 28 degrees Fahrenheit, actually below the freezing point of fresh water because of the salt content. It's the original ice bucket challenge, but there's no social media reward, and the ice is the entire ocean. The quirky fringe tidbit that provides a strange, dark glimmer of humor in this moment is the story of Charles Joen, the ship's head baker. While everyone else was panicking, Joen supposedly spent the final hours drinking a significant amount of fortifying whiskey. When the ship went down, he claimed he simply stepped off the stern into the water without even getting his hair wet. Because of the alcohol in his system, he didn't feel the cold as intensely and managed to tread water for hours until he was rescued. He's the patron saint of bad timing turned into good luck, a man who survived the greatest maritime disaster in history because he was too relaxed to realize he should be dead. You, however, didn't have a bottle of whiskey. You just have your heavy wool coat, which is now acting like a lead weight, pulling you down into the black. The sensation of the water is like being hit by a freight train made of needles. Your lungs seize up in a cold shock response, an involuntary gasp that is the ocean's way of trying to drown you instantly. Your modern brain tries to process the temperature, but there is no contemporary comparison for this. It's colder than the inside of your freezer. It's colder than a winter night in Siberia. It's a temperature that stops time. You struggle to the surface, your head breaking through the foam, and the world is a different place. The Titanic is gone. The unsinkable miracle has vanished, leaving only a few bubbles and a haunting, localized fog created by the warm air of the ship meeting the freezing sea. The sound has changed again. The roar of the sinking is replaced by the sound of the many. It's a high-pitched, collective wail, 1,000 voices crying out in the dark. It's a sound that survivors would later describe as the most haunting thing they ever heard, a noise that never quite left the ears. It's a sensory overload of the worst kind. You are bobbing in the dark, your limbs already starting to feel like they belong to someone else. The brutal reality of the third class is that you are now part of a statistic. You look around for a lifeboat, but they are gone, ghosting away into the darkness to avoid being swamped by the drowning. You are a tiny, insignificant speck in a 2-mile deep graveyard. You find a piece of wood, perhaps a part of that fake oak paneling from the general room or a fragment of a door. You cling to it, your fingers already losing their ability to grip. The jokes about the Jack and Rose door from the movie suddenly feel very unfunny when you realize that the real problem isn't space, it's the fact that the wood is as cold as the water and your body heat is draining into the Atlantic like water through a sieve. You realize that your great adventure has ended in a physics equation that you are losing. The unsinkable branding was a bit of a stretch, wasn't it? If you could leave a review right now, it would definitely be 1 star. Great service, but the ship broke in half and I'm currently a human popsicle. As you float there, the stars above are still indifferent. The water is settling, the ripples from the ship's final plunge smoothing out. The silence begins to return, one voice at a time as the cold does its work. You think about the Scotland Road and the G deck and the hidden friends you shared your cabin with. You think about the Irishman snoring and how you give anything to hear it one more time. The brutal reality of the Titanic's third class wasn't just the locked gates or the lack of boats, it was the fact that even at the very end, the ocean is the ultimate equalizer. It doesn't care about your ticket or your dreams, it only cares about the heat in your blood, and it's taking it bit by bit into the dark. The world has narrowed down to the size of a wooden plank and the rhythmic, agonizing pulse of your own fading heartbeat. The great steel whale is gone, resting now on the silt of the abyss 2 miles below your dangling feet. Up here, on the surface of the North Atlantic, the aftermath is a haunting, silent tableau. The brutal reality of the Titanic's third class has reached its final, quiet chapter. You are floating in a debris field of dreams. A floating cabin biscuit here, a submerged wool cap there, and the wreckage of 1,000 lives that were supposed to begin in New York but ended in the stars. The air is so still it feels brittle, and the water is as flat as a mirror, reflecting the cold, indifferent brilliance of the Milky Way. It is a beauty so profound it feels like an insult to the tragedy unfolding within it. Historians still argue whether the Carpathia, the ship that eventually came to the rescue, could have arrived sooner if the wireless operators on nearby vessels hadn't gone to bed, or if the mystery ship seen on the horizon could have saved everyone. For you, these are abstract debates for a future you might not see. Your reality is the encroaching numbness that has moved from your fingertips to your elbows, and now into your very chest. It is a strange, paradoxical sensation. After the initial burn of the ice, you now feel a heavy, seductive warmth. This is the body's final lie, the quirky fringe tidbit of hypothermia, where the brain misinterprets the closing of blood vessels as a surge of heat. You feel like you are back in your seaweed-stuffed bunk, the ship's engines humming a distant, comforting song. The smell of the aftermath is a ghostly thing. The sharp ozone and sulfur have drifted away, replaced by the scent of pure, unadulterated cold. It is a scent that has no modern equivalent. Perhaps the smell of a deep freeze unit if it were filled with fresh sea salt and the memory of a winter night. You catch a glimpse of a white shape bobbing nearby. It's a lifebelt made of cork and canvas, its owner long gone into the dark. It looks like a discarded toy in a giant black bathtub. You realize that for the hundreds of third-class passengers who never made it to the boat deck, this water was their only destination. The brutal reality is that of the 710 third-class passengers on board, only about 174 survived. The math was always against you, a cold equation of class and logistics that ended in this silent, frozen sea. A mainstream historical fact that adds a layer of poignancy to this moment is that the recovery of the bodies in the weeks following the sinking was also dictated by class. Those found in first-class attire were often embalmed and returned to their families, while many third-class victims, identified only by their rough wool clothing or the inspection cards in their pockets, were buried at sea with a simple weighted grate. Even in death, the hierarchy of the White Star Line remained intact. But as you drift here, you realize the ocean doesn't recognize those distinctions. To the Atlantic, you are just carbon and salt returning to the source. The labyrinth of the G deck is gone. The Scotland Road is a vertical passage to the floor of the world. All the barriers have finally dissolved. You find your thoughts drifting back to the beginning. The smell of the Southampton docks, the taste of the plum pudding, the sound of the fiddle in the general room. You remember the face of the Swedish girl teaching her brother to say New York. You wonder if they made it to a boat or if they are now part of the silent United Nations, resting in the deep. There is a strange peace in the memory. You realize that despite the brutal reality, you were part of something magnificent. You were a passenger on the Titanic. You saw the peak of human ambition and the raw, terrifying power of nature. You are a dreamer in a city of steel. The horizon is beginning to show a faint, bruised purple line, the first hint of a dawn that the Titanic will never see. The stars are starting to pale. You feel your grip on the wood loosen, not because you are afraid, but because you are tired. The hidden friends are calling from below, and the vibration of the engines, the one you thought had stopped, seems to be returning. A deep, sub-bass hum that feels like the heartbeat of the earth itself. You close your eyes, the image of the Statue of Liberty flickering in your mind one last time, not as a monument of copper and stone, but as a beacon of light in the middle of a dark, dark ocean. The water is still now, the ripples of history smoothing over the spot where the great ship once reigned. As we leave the freezing reaches of the North Atlantic, let the cold fade away, replaced by the warmth of your own bed. The heavy wool coats and the salt spray are gone, drifting into the mists of the past. Imagine the great whale of steel resting quietly in the dark, silent museum of a bygone age draped in rust and memories. The voices of the general room are now just a soft, distant murmur, like the wind through autumn leaves. Feel the weight of your own limbs, heavy and relaxed against your mattress. The rhythmic thump-thump of the engines has transformed into the steady, calming beat of your own heart. You are safe, you are warm. The journey is over, and the shore is finally beneath your feet. The stars above you now are the same ones that watched over the Titanic, but they are peaceful, watching over you with a soft, silver glow. Let the darkness be a soft blanket, tucking you in, shielding you from the noise of the modern world. The labyrinth is solved. The gates are all open. There are no more stairs to climb, no more cold to fight, just a gentle, rocking motion of a dreamless sleep. Everything is quiet. Everything is still. The ocean is deep and the night is long, but you are home. Sweet dreams of distant horizons and quiet seas.